Hello, good evening and welcome back. Yesterday we made our pockets and today we're going to do our shoulder seams and our neckline ribbing. So whichever style you're making, this is going to be relevant to you. Now in the booklet, the Tilly and the Buttons booklet, they suggest that you might like to stabilise your shoulder seams before sewing them together. And this is with particularly stretchy fabrics. This will help them retain their shape throughout their life. So where you're kind of pulling them on, taking them off and what have you, this will help to keep their shape. So I'm going to show you how to do that next. Now, for stabilising your shoulder seams, you always do this on the back. So I've got my back panel in front of me here. Here's my neckline. My shoulder seams are here and here, and here are my armholes. And I'm looking at the wrong side of the fabric. And you can use some ribbon. I've got 2 pieces of ribbon cut. You could use some twill tape, stay tapes, just like cotton, 1 centimetre wide cotton tape, or you can use some clear elastic, which is kind of specific for this job. Just to keep it easy and simple, I'm going to use the ribbon, nice satin ribbon. It's just something that will kind of hold it and won't stretch. Now, you'll see on this side, hopefully you can see that black line there. I find this really helpful to draw on. Now, we know our seam allowance is 1.5 centimetres. So what I do is I've got my quilting ruler, which I find really useful for dressmaking, even though it's meant for quilting. And I just come down 1.5 centimetres and line that 1.5 centimetre line up with the raw edge there. And I just actually use an erasable pen, what are they called now, friction pens. They're just meant for handwriting actually, for practicing handwriting. You can buy them in Sainsbury's, but you could use a chalk pen or any kind of fabric marker that you like. And I just draw on that 1.5 centimetre seam line. And I just find that helps me to keep everything where I need it to be. So once I've done that, then I can take my satin ribbon and I just want to place that so that the bottom edge of the satin ribbon is lining up with that line. And then I can use some wonder clips and hold that in place, or I could use pins. I'll pop a couple of those on just to hold that ribbon nice and straight along that line. And what this will do is it will just stop that seam from stretching out whilst you're wearing the garment. And I've got pink here. It doesn't have to match just because it's going to be on the wrong side and you're not really going to see it. So don't worry too much about what colour you use, but I actually really love how pink and grey look together, so I'm using pink. You may have noticed that I like pink quite a lot. So I'm now going to use a zigzag stitch, and I'm going to set that at 2.5 by 2.5. So you may have a digital dial or a manual dial, but you want 2.5 stitch length and 2.5 zigzag width. And we're just going to zigzag that ribbon to the shoulder seam. We're just going to sew down the middle here. So let's hop over to the machine and do that. So here I am at my machine, and you can see my ribbon there with the underside matching up with that line. I'm going to select my zigzag stitch and 2.5 by 2.5. I'll put my needle in and off I go, and I'm just going to come through the middle of this ribbon. Nice and slowly, and I'm just lifting up my foot there to reposition myself. I just took the wonder clip out of the way there because it was going to get in the way. There you go. So that's now attached to the shoulder seam on the wrong side and on the back, and I'll do that on both sides. There, so my shoulder seams are now stabilised. I've trimmed off the little bit of ribbon that was hanging over at either end, and I'm now going to attach my front bodice to my back bodice at the shoulder seams. So let's go. I'm going to create a nice circle in the middle for our neckline. So there's my front, and I've put that down facing right sides up, and then I get my back and I'll put that facing right sides down so that right sides are together, and I'm just going to take those two shoulders and match them together. I've got a notch in the middle there that helps me, and you can use wonder clips if you like, or you can use pins. Now I'm going to create the seam on my overlocker, and whenever I'm sewing on my overlocker I always use wonder clips, not pins. I would never want to get pins near my overlocker, because if you miss one and you accidentally leave one in your fabric and it gets into the mechanism of your overlocker, it can cause quite a lot of trouble. So I use wonder clips with overlocking, and I use pins or sometimes wonder clips with you when I'm using my sewing machine, and that kind of works for me. Wonder clips, you can't miss them, you know you can see them to take them out, but pins can, they can evade you. You can accidentally leave one in, and then if it gets into the mechanism of your overlocker, you're in trouble. Overlockers, you don't want to get into trouble with an overlocker. So here we are. Now the next step is quite simply to sew your back bodice to your front bodice together at those two shoulder seams. Now if you've done the stage that I did of applying the ribbon, it's very obvious where you're sewing because you're sewing along that line or along the bottom of the ribbon. If you haven't done that, you can mark your seam allowance on if you like, or if you're using your sewing machine, you can it's a 1.5 centimetre seam allowance. So if you're going to sew this shoulder seam on your sewing machine, you're just going to pop this under your machine, and you're going to match those raw edges there up with your number 15 line on your needle plate, and that will mean that you're going to sew down there. And you're using that stretch stitch ballpoint needle as we were yesterday, and you can use your preferred choice of stitch, whether it be a lightning bolt stretch stitch or a zigzag stitch, whichever works for you, and you're going to sew those together here. So I'm going to use my overlocker, and I'm going to talk you through that now, but if you're using a sewing machine, you're simply going to sew along there, and then you can trim a little bit down and press those seam allowances open. You've no need with jersey or with knit fabrics to finish the raw edges. They're not going to fray like they would with woven. So if you're using a sewing machine, just simply sew down there, trim, press open, and that seam is done. I'm going to talk you through now how we're going to do this on an overlocker. Now, before we get started sewing on our overlocker, I wanted to take you through how you're going to be set up. So you're going to use all 4 threads. You're going to use 2 needles because we're actually sewing and finishing in one go. So you're going to need all 4 threads and both needles. Let's just pull those threads back there. They got a bit saggy overnight. Right, you want to make sure that your threads are nice and well and truly in their tension dials, and you just need normal tension. So for my overlocker, that's 4 on each dial. And you are going to need just a normal stitch length. Mine is 2.5. The best advice I can give is to save a scrap of your fabric and to test your stitches before moving on to your main piece of work, your main project. Now I've got a piece of scrap here, and I want to talk to you about differential feed because this is important to get right when you're sewing with your overlocker. Now, differential feed, most overlockers have differential feed. What this means is, if I lift this foot here, I don't know if you can see, but under there I've got 2 sets of feed dogs, one at the front and one at the back. And the feed dogs are the jaggedy bits underneath which drag your fabric through the machine as you sew. Now with a sewing machine you have 1 set of feed dogs, and that just moves back and forth, pulling your fabric through. With an overlocker you have 1 at the back and 1 at the front. You have 2 sets of feed dogs. And these feed dogs can either work in unison together, or they can work stretching out, or they can work scrunching up. So when your differential feed is set to neutral, your overlocker is just going to drag the fabric through like this. Now with stretch fabrics, what can happen is it's a bit of a beast of a machine, there's a lot going on, and whilst it's being dragged through your machine, it can actually stretch your knit fabric and you'll end up with a ripply, wavy seam. So to overcome that, what we do is we increase the differential feed. And what that does is it makes those feed dogs scrunch the fabric up together and thus eliminates that waving. So this is why on an overlocker which has differential feed, you can use it to create wavy, fancy edges, or you can use it to create gathers by putting the differential feed in the other direction. Probably the best thing for me to do at this point, because I've probably lost you now, is to demonstrate. So I'm just going to set my differential feed to neutral and show you what happens. Oh, I haven't put my foot down. Don't do that. So there you go. So I've now sewn those two layers of fabric together using just a neutral differential feed. And can you see, I don't know if it's very clear on there, but can you see how that's wobbling and waving? I've got almost like waves there. And that's what we want to eliminate. So how we eliminate that is for the next one. What we'll do is we will now increase that differential feed to between 1.5 and 2. About 1.8. Now can you see the difference between those two? Look at how nice that looks. It's completely flat. There's none of that wobbly wavy effect that we had. Do you remember this wobbly wavy one there? It's not so dramatic now that it's been lobbed off. But this one is now nice and true and it hasn't stretched the seam out. Just to show you, just for fun, I'm going to put it all the way back in the other direction to 0.7 and show you the difference. There you go. So can you see how wavy that is? It's really stretched the fabric apart as it's sewn it, compared with that one where the differential was set up at 1.8. So that's the difference really. So get a scrap of fabric and have a play. And mine was perfect when it was on 1.8, so that's what I'm going to put it at. And just get it so that you're happy that your fabric is not being stretched by your overlocker. That's what it looks like when you put it on 0.7, really crazy. And actually you can use that to make a nice kind of frill when you want to, but we certainly don't want frilly shoulders. So here we go, we're going to start overlocking now. Lovely, so we're ready to go. I'm going to position my fabric underneath my overlocker foot. And on my foot I've got two little notches there, and those notches correspond to where my needles are. So I can see that left hand notch is where my left hand needle is going to be, and I want that to be lined up with the seam that I drew on. That way I know I'm going to have a nice 1.5 centimetre seam allowance. If you don't have that, just use your eye just to check that this needle here is going to end up sewing on here. What you don't want to do is deviate away from your seam allowances. It's very easy on a sewing machine because you're going to match this raw edge up with your 1.5 or 15 line on your needle plate, and it's easy to see. On an overlocker it's not quite so easy to see. Mine also has this gauge here, and I can see this is 1.5 centimetres or 5/8 of an inch, and I can see that line there is matching up with my raw edge, but it's just not as easy to see on an overlocker. And that's why I'd always suggest to draw on, if you're not using the ribbon, obviously that's a nice guide, but it's always to draw on your seam allowances where you can on an overlocker, especially on these easy straight seams, and then you'll get it correct and you'll get it consistent. Now the overlocker is going to sew here, that's where my left hand needle is going to go in. We're going to have our sort of overlocked seam here, and this bit's going to get chopped off by the blade. So I've now done both of my shoulder seams, and on the overlocked version obviously they're sandwiched together, so you're just going to then press them towards the back on both sides. So what will happen is that pink ribbon will end up being hidden, and trim off any of these thread tails. So give that a press, and then we'll take a look at doing the neckline. So there's our neckline created there. Sewn our shoulder seams and press those seam allowances towards the back if we're overlocking, or press them open and flat if you're on a sewing machine. So we're going to put that to one side, and we're now going to look at our neckline facing.